Okay, so this is going to be a little bit different of a video than what I normally make. Typically I make videos on conference histories and stuff like that, and the prime focal point of that is the realignment of conferences and the switching around of teams and stuff like that. This is going to be a little bit more casual. I'm also a K-State guy. I spent 4 years working for the football video department as a student assistant. I graduated from there. Been a K-State guy my whole life. So from that point of view, I'm really a Big 12 guy because that's where K-State lives. So I'm really big on the rivalries and stuff. And of course, one of the major downsides to this new iteration of the Big 12 as opposed to the past is that all the big time rivalries really are gone. 20 years ago, this conference had the Red River Shootout, it had Bedlam, it had Colorado, Nebraska, the Border War, OU, Nebraska, just so many high profile, high hatred sorts of rivalry games. And once those teams all left to other conferences, it really just left the conference with a few holes, essentially. And so when the Big 12 announced they were adding all these new teams, there was a hope that since the conference seemed to be prioritizing rivalries with expansion, grabbing Utah for BYU, grabbing Colorado for the old Big 8 schools, grabbing the Arizona schools together, giving West Virginia an old Big East rival in Cincy, that the scheduling would sort of prioritize those rivalries too. But a couple of weeks ago, the Big 12 released its 2024 scheduling matrix for football, and that is very clearly not the case. I'm going to scroll through these in the background. You can pause and see all of them, but one thing that's very clear is that the Big 12 has only protected 4 rivalries to be played every year. You get the Holy War with Utah and BYU, Duel in the Desert with Arizona and ASU, Sunflower Showdown with K-State and KU, and the Rivalry with Baylor and TCU. That's it. No Farmageddon, no West Virginia Cincinnati, no Battle for the Saddle, really no Texas Tech with anybody in Texas. There are a few reasons for this. First is that there really isn't much connecting any of the new additions to the rest of them, except for maybe Houston, since they have a history with all the Texas schools and the other American additions like Cincy and UCF. So by forcing every team to have played the other 15 schools at least once in a 4-year span, you create a familiarity. As weird as it is for UCF to be in a conference with Arizona now, like the Big 12 really wants it to feel like, yes, UCF will play Arizona. This isn't a few conferences in one. We really do want to be a mega conference. So if you go with a pod system, or what's called a 3-3-6, there's a big chance if you're, say, Arizona, that you only play in Orlando once in like 6 years, right? So let's say in a pod system, you're in the West pod, you'll play the members of the East pod every 3 years, but you'll only be out there once for one of those teams. So if the team travels to you that year, you have to wait now maybe 3 more years for a return trip or even just a chance to see him again now that divisions are gone. So this scheduling system sort of gives the Big 12 members time to mesh. Everyone will play everyone at least twice. Conference feels a lot cozier, that sort of thing. That's one positive to it. That's something Commissioner Yormark leaned in heavily when he announced the schedule. He said, I took this from Sports Illustrated, as we look towards the future of the conference, we are thrilled to introduce the first football scheduling matrix for the new look Big 12. I'm grateful to our membership for their support throughout the scheduling process. In this model, competitive balance and student-athlete wellness was prioritized, rivalries will be protected, and new matchups will be introduced. The excitement and parity this conference is known for will continue for years to come. So they're also definitely trying to give the league time to create new rivalries between members, which I also understand. Like Colorado might form one with West Virginia, or Houston and UCF could finally become the space race, or Arizona or KU could become the big basketball rivalry everyone thinks it can be, just one of those deals. But it feels like the negatives are just too painful at this point. And K-State's right in the center of one of them, so I feel at least a little qualified to be talking about it. There are football rivalries that have been played more often and with longer streaks than K-State and Iowa State, which the fan base refers to as Farmageddon. But there has not been a single interruption in that football game, start to present. So it's the longest running college football rivalry to have never been interrupted, I think the language is. Like, it might not be a big ticket rivalry to the rest of the country. Like, most of you guys probably don't care about this game, but this is a game of familiarity and recently contempt for these two schools. Like, this game means something to us. But since it's not protected, it's just gone in 2027. Like, it'll peak out at 109 games or whatever. And this isn't the only game that we would have liked to have protected and isn't going to be. Like, some people can talk about the Rocky Mountain Showdown not being protected, Utah, Colorado. Ask the fan bases for those two teams. Like, they kind of don't care. That was a forced rivalry from the Pac-12 that failed to really achieve anything. Like, if anything, those two schools like each other more than dislike each other. But there are so many other games that could have been protected that just flat out weren't, even if they weren't necessarily rivalries. Like Cincinnati, West Virginia is technically a rivalry, but it isn't all that heated. Probably never was. But at the same time, those two schools are relatively close for this new Big 12 conference. So it'd make total sense for them to play each other every year, if only for like travel, you know? Same with West Virginia, UCF. Like those Eastern teams are on an island out there. It just makes sense for them to be in a pod or have some sort of scheduling agreement. But nope, you get Arizona and you'll like it. But Farmageddon was really the most absurd game to not protect, even if that would mean K-State had 2 protected rivalries. Like, other than the Sunflower Showdown, like, this is the only other marquee old Big 8 game left, right? Now, a response letter, purportedly from Iowa State Athletic Director Jamie Pollard to a fan asking why the game wasn't kept, circulated quite a bit that explained the reasoning. I should note that this was pushed by Iowa State meme account Cyclone Larry. If you know Iowa State, you know about Cyclone Larry. The language in it does seem a bit fishy, so take it with as many grains of salt as you can find. But if this letter is genuine, it contains quite a bit of information. For one, the athletic directors themselves are happy with the schedule, which means they probably work together to select this as the best option in their eyes, even more than a pod system or something else. The second paragraph being written the way it does makes me believe it's faked, more than being circulated by Cyclone Larry, of all accounts. Because the way this is written doesn't feel at all like it was written by a Division I athletic director to a random fan in an email. I mean, what athletic director would throw their own fans under the bus for not traveling? And K-State's been pushing Farmageddon as a rivalry game as much, if not more, than Iowa State has been recently. Like, that's just my perception of it as a K-State fan. So that angle doesn't really make sense either. So, I mean, choose to take as much from this as you'd like. I think it isn't real personally, but as far as I'm aware, like, it hasn't officially been debunked yet. I could be wrong, but I don't know. So obviously, I asked in the community post earlier how you guys felt about the schedules. The most important thing that I took away from it was that a majority of my subscribers don't care about the Big 12 at all. Just under 700 of you guys said you don't care about the schedule at all. And I know a lot of my viewer base is in the South, so you're probably SEC, ACC, Sun Belt, you know, that sort of thing. I'm a K-State guy, a Big 12 guy, so that's my angle here. But a majority of the Big 12 fans there actively dislike it, and that's something I've seen mirrored in the Twitter and Reddit responses. And as I'm sure you can figure out, that I'm not a fan of it either, as someone who has to watch yearly Farmageddon die in 2027. But some of you guys had some interesting takes here in the comments of that post that I thought I'd get into, because there are some good points being made here. Alex S. says, I like no divisions, as it is objectively better for college football playoff hopes, and I enjoy the diversity of matchups. But I think they should have kept KSU-ISU as a rivalry matchup. No harm in KSU having 2 rivalries. The whole no divisions thing is objectively true. Like, just about every other conference is starting to move away from divisions and towards just putting their 2 best teams in the conference in their championship game. Like, that's the way that they've determined is the best way to put a team in the championship game. But yeah, Farmageddon being lost as a yearly game hurts. You knew that already. John Shaver actually disagrees with me on pods being the prime option. He disagrees that the schedule promotes rivalries. And I actually kind of agree with that. Like, in what world does Colorado playing Cincinnati twice magically create a rivalry between those 2 schools? Like, most rivalries occur due to years upon years of history or some type of geographic or cultural similarity. Like, close games don't do it. Like, as a K-State fan, I don't consider K-State TCU a game that will become a rivalry, even though those games have gotten testy at times. It's just a rough game. You know, there's way more of a history between us and Oklahoma State, and even that game doesn't really count as a rivalry. So, NC YouTube and Gracie here, though, point out that the conference doesn't really have any rivalries, and from an outsider's perspective, that's probably true. But that really got me thinking. Because inside the Big 12, there are some testy games that might not get recognized from the rest of the country, but have the capability to become rivalries like really quick, like that. Like, I think about the Xerox Bowl, or the Dust Bowl, between Tech and Oklahoma State, how there's some real beef there between those 2 schools. With Texas and Oklahoma leaving, like, those 2 are in prime position to make that into a real rivalry because the bad blood's already there. I think to Cincinnati, West Virginia, that game's interesting because there's a lot of shared Big East history, but it's another one of those games like Utah, Colorado that just doesn't really have the vibrancy at the moment. Because of the proximity they have with each other and that history existing, it really could become a rivalry. I think back to Cincy Pitt, River City rivalry, as an example of somewhat forced regional rivalry with Cincy in the past, because the Paddle Wheel Trophy, like, I think it wasn't even brought out for the game this season. Like, Cincy really only cares about their rivals in Louisville and Miami of Ohio, and neither of those two are conference rivals. The fact that they don't have a rival in conference doesn't necessarily mean that they should rush into one with West Virginia, but they're more likely to create one with them, I think, than anyone else, except for maybe, I don't know, UCF. Because that's the in-conference team they hate the most right now. Speaking of UCF, it's a little bit like West Virginia UCF. You know, those two are historically chippy teams way out east that I think could develop a rivalry if they played each other more often. And really, with UCF, I'm surprised they don't have much of a rivalry with Houston. They call themselves Space U. Houston's done some stuff with NASA in the past. Neither of them really deserve to be called Space U since Purdue exists, but that's a different conversation for an entirely different time. But if I were to do conference scheduling, I definitely would have preferred the pod system. It's not perfect, of course, but with conferences getting so large, there's really no perfect way to formulate the conference schedule anymore. Easiest pod system I could come up with had 4 pods, Western, Central, Northern, Southern, Eastern. I did this kind of interestingly, as you'll see with the Central and Eastern pods, but let me try to explain. So in the West, you have the Utah and Arizona schools. This pod has a lot of history, with each of these schools being members of the WAC at some point in their history, maybe all at the same time, if I'm correct. I could be wrong. 2 of the league's strongest rivalries are kept here. They play teams close to each other regionally. Like, that's a solid pod. That's 1 of 4. Then we go to the South, which is an interesting one. Because I left Colorado out of the Western pod, they end up in the Central pod. So Oklahoma State ends up in the Southern pod. But this ends up working out pretty well for the conference, though, because the Dust Bowl ends up fitting pretty well in that slate. OSU joins Tech, Baylor, and TCU for this one. Tech has a lot of rivals from the old Southwest, but not any they could really claim to be their number one. They've had a few scrummy games with Houston lately, but their real history lies with, Texas and A&M, both of which are gone now. So that being said, they do have long histories with both Baylor and TCU, and Oklahoma State, of course, has been getting testy recently, so that's a new rivalry for the conference to focus on. Up north to the Central, or the Northern pod, we have Colorado, K-State, Kansas, and Iowa State. These old Big 8 rivals hated each other back in the 90s, and with Colorado coming back, it just makes too much sense not to bring back some of the old Big 12 North. Some Colorado fans online have distinct memories of games against K-State being testy during the Snyder years. I just can't see the blue-collar fan bases of, like, K-State or Iowa State really getting along with the new blood Colorado fan base at the moment. Like, this could have ended up just being a pod full of hate, and that would have been a good thing, Farmageddon and the Sunflower Showdown stick around, too. Another thing that gets lost in the Matrix stuff is that KU's been a long-time opponent for Iowa State, too, so that game gets preserved. Probably the pod that makes the most sense. And then we get to the East. The issue with the East is that there are only 3 Eastern time zone teams, I think, in the Big 12. So one school would have had to be the odd man out. And I chose Houston, mainly because, despite them being old members of the Southwest, they do have a lot more recent history against Cincy and UCF as members than the Americans. So they just make more sense than Iowa State to be added. And like I said before, those teams don't really have any rivalries out here. It's more like a pod of travel convenience. It's just way easier to get to West Virginia from UCF or Cincinnati than it would be from, like, Provo, Utah every year. And a pod system really works best in a 3-3-6 conference schedule. So what's the 3-3-6? So the 3-3-6 has 3 sections in it. First 3 is your non-conference games, which can be scheduled, throughout the year. Next 3 are your pod games. You play those conference teams every year. And then the 6 is some combination of other conference teams. The most popular version of this has 4 of those 6 games being against members of a specific pod. So one year you'd play like all the members of the Western pod, the next you'd play all the members of the Eastern pod, whatever. Like what the NFL does. And then there's 2 more conference games in there that might be protected rivalries from outside pods or whatever can be thrown in there to make the schedule work. So that's how I would do it. Clearly, it's a terrible idea since they didn't go with it. And maybe it's a good thing that they didn't go with it. I don't know. I might eventually make a video predicting the future rivalries of the Big 12, like the Xerox Bowl, but for now, this is the situation the Big 12 is dealing with when it comes to scheduling and rivalries. I'm interested in how you guys feel about this, though, especially from those of you that are outside the Big 12, because most people inside the Big 12 hate it. Like, it just feels like such a massive miss. Just because a game doesn't have a name doesn't mean it's not important. Like, I think about Texas Tech. They have a history with just about every old Southwest school, and none of those games are protected. I think about Oklahoma State. Their biggest rival is gone. Like, they don't even get a protected game against any of the old Big 8 schools. Like, theoretically, they could go an entire season in the future without playing Colorado, K-State, KU, or Iowa State under the system. Like, it could happen. New rivalries like the Dust Bowl, a battle for the saddle, are being stunted. Like, West Virginia doesn't get any travel protection with the schools closest to it. UCF is just screwed. But hey, everybody plays each other. So yeah, I'll go back to regular content you expect from me soon. I just had to get this video out because I think it's important to recognize that conference realignment, especially in a conference as spread out as the Big 12, doesn't have to stunt the growth of its own brands just so every team can play each other. Like, rivalries are a fun part of college sports, and it's unique to it. As a Chiefs fan, like, Chiefs Raiders is heated, but it's nowhere near college sports rivalries. Like, pro sports just aren't even close. So yeah, let me know. Have a great weekend. Stay safe. Be civil in the comments, and I'll see you next time.